So thank you so much for coming to this session today. As you can see, it's on misinformation in modern democracies. And I would just like to take a brief minute to just introduce our wonderful panel. We have Andre here, and this is Tanya, this is Faye, and this is Mark Ivan. And yes. So I just want to jump right in because we are short on time and the topic is quite large. So, you know, we all know this, but we have never ever before had access to as much information in the history of humankind. And as Chisholm said in her opening remarks, so this is a good thing, but there's also a flip side to it. And so when it comes to information, it can also be harmful, especially if it's false. So the first question for all of our panelists, it feels a little bit like a beauty pageant, is there a universal approach in how information should be checked? Go for it.
I would say, both yes and no. I don't think that there's a universal approach per se. I think whenever we're dealing with people, to take, social context into consideration. So for that thing, it might be universal. So really think about specifically for information or misinformation, who does it involve, who does it affect, who does it harm, and how do we connect with those people? How do we ask them really what they need and what they need other people to do to either support or advocate for them, and then do that. So within my place of working with employee experience and employers, it's really about practicing active listening. When you look at it in a broader leadership style, we talk about empathetic leadership, and their active listening is really a key part of driving that psychological safety. And then after you listen, then act on what you've heard that people need from you, so that you can actually role model what that safety and what that protection or what that support looks like. So just before I move on, just to think about this where we can use unconscious bias training. So I'm not a fan of unconscious bias training as a silver bullet for figuring out DEI, but I think that it's so good in terms of thinking critically about what do we believe, why do we believe it, and how do we act critically about our sources, where we stand, and where the information came from.
Thank you. Very good points, especially about active listening. Ms. Faye.
So I'm going to also say not really. No, I don't think that universal approaches really work. And I want to situate that in the context of the work that I do at an international nonprofit called Salzburg Global Seminar. We bring people together from all over the world to talk about different topics of global concern. And the approach that we take to that is to be interdisciplinary, intergenerational, and inclusive in the way that we're convening those programs. And I think that any kind of approach that aims to be universal just does not work. It does not take into account those complexities, the different places from which people are coming. The second place to situate my work is in the sphere of arts and culture. So if we think about culture, creativity, creative expression, the idea of truth within that context is something that's quite difficult to pin down, and that notion of truth is very different depending on the different cultures that people are coming from. The value, I would say, in art lies in its ambiguity. It lies in the fact that it is there to be interpreted and can hold multiple perspectives within it. And I think that as soon as we start to move towards any idea of a rigid truth, then we lose the opportunity to be thinking creatively, to exploring cultural nuance. And I also mentioned was around if we move towards any kind of universal approach, we risk reinforcing dominant cultural perspectives, especially from the global north. And if we're doing the work of decolonization, which I imagine many of us in this room are, I don't think that a universal approach helps us or lifts us up in being able to do that work as well. So that would be my reflections, Melanie. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Tanya?
I would argue that since we do not have united access, and nor do we have a shared understanding of what media literacy is, and with the current social media that is being flooded by AI-generated information, we cannot presume that a universal law will be able to govern how free and at the same time how safe our media really is. I would argue for, instead of limiting people's rights, to think about what access are people getting to social media and what such of social media is being permitted, because the real question is the social media providers are then creating the social media and media that we are consuming above and beyond media agencies that the governments are legitimately providing.
Thank you. Andre?
This is a very interesting question. I think in a world that we live in right now, that we create more than 328 million of terabytes of data per day, it's very appealing to think about a universal, a global approach, but the answer or the question is, who is going to be responsible for conducting this fact-checking approach? So in other words, who is going to have the final answer? And this can definitely emphasize some of the discussions we're having right now in terms of the North Global still predominant in the ideas and the things that we also know, racism and these things. So I think what we need is to have a multilateral approach. That's what we should think about it. We should think about civil society, governments, NGOs coming together, because fact-checking, what recent studies shows is it's good for actually correct some factual errors, but it's difficult to change opinions, entrench opinions and beliefs of people. So media literacy is definitely the way we should think about this issue, and policymakers should create public policies thinking about how algorithms works and how they target different races, different people, different factors that like age and also political ideology. And this way, if policymakers can actually build media literacy thinking in this way, we can actually find a way of diminishing and combat the misinformation. I think there is and I just want to conclude saying, there is a very nice sentence of Aaron Swartz. He said that it's very difficult to build a community, especially a digital community, and I think sometimes we forget that internet now it's also a community that we have to think about it. And to build a community, it requires the right amount of people, rules, and technology. So we have to have this community building approach and thinking about internet in that way also.
All very salient points. And so we're talking about literacy in media, but I'd like to take a step back. And what about this concept of free speech? And Tanya, in your work as an NGO and a community organizer and all that you do, I feel like you have a compelling perspective on free speech. So can you give us just a couple of minutes on some of your perspective?
Sure. I'm going to read a quote from Mary Song, a researcher who looks at how Twitter discussions on racism in the UK are driven by public controversies. And this is a culture of racial equivalence, where public understanding of racism are highly imprecise, broad, and when used to describe a wide range of racialized phenomena, becomes a conceptual inflation. And this is taken from a book called Is Free Speech Racist? I highly recommend it. And the problem with free speech is that it is often used to wield power, and power by those, for example, populist movements, those in the far right, which we are seeing right now in Europe and also in the Nordics, taking center stage. And so the argument about the freedom of speech is biased, because speech that dehumanizes people is very much on the forefront of freedom of speech wielders. And freedom of speech cannot be used in this way.
Thank you so much, because I think I wanted to give you that space because it actually is a wonderful transition to the next question. And that is, should there be stronger and clearly articulated governmental or workplace guardrails and repercussions around free speech? So, Mark Ivan.
Yes, in short. In shortness, and there needs to be so much more. I mean, when we look at workplace culture and engagement, there is not enough accountability. We talked about it this morning in a lot of the keynote speeches, is that for us to build psychological safety and create an inclusive workplace where people of diverse backgrounds can thrive, we first of all need to have rules of engagement, right? We all come from different backgrounds, different cultures. Intercultural management and communication is definitely a skill that can be learned and should be focused on in training. But also what that does is that it creates this conversation of like, what are the rules of engagement in this organization if we are a workplace? Like, what do we accept? What don't we accept? When we talk with each other, when we communicate, when we share information, in which way do we do that? In which way do we expect other people to follow up and to listen? But also, what do we do when we disagree? What do we do when we harm other people? When do we believe that harm has taken place? And if we believe that, then what do we do about it? How do we hold people accountable? It's a bad word, but like, how do we penalize people? What sanctions do we put in so that we can uphold the trust in the agreements, the social contract we have with each other, which all falls under what we call DI strategy or employee engagement policies. And this is where the conversation of free speech also comes in terms of what is actually free speech in this context for us as people that are also trying to get work done and work together. So yes, it's unfortunately I don't see enough consideration of what rules of engagements are, but also how do we uphold them and how do we hold people accountable? More accountability specifically for leaders who should, of course, be role modeling and leading this space.
Thank you. Yes, it's true. They should be. We all know that doesn't always happen. So it's the accountability really does come into play here. Faye, what are your thoughts?
So I don't know if I agree with you, but I'm going to talk to this from a different perspective, I think. And so again, I'll situate what I'm going to say in sort of the space of cultural rights, in the space of creativity and freedom of expression in that sense. And using the art world as an example, because it would be a place that we would sort of expect or hope that people are more free to express themselves within their artistic and creative practice. But unfortunately, in recent years, I think we're seeing that that is less and less the case. And so I'll give you a few examples of the guardrails, I would say, being constrictive and being used to censor. One prominent example is the Documenta 15 exhibition that happened in 2022 in Kassel in Germany. It was significant because it was the first Documenta to be curated by non-Western curators. So the curators were a group, an artistic collective from Indonesia called Ruang Grupta. And the group faced accusations of anti-Semitism for some of the works that were included within the show. And obviously this has to be situated in the context of Germany and the historical sensitivities that exist there within the context of anti-Semitism. But I think we also have to see that the artists were using this work to speak as a critique of state violence, and the outcome of all of this in the end was that unfortunately the work was taken down and removed from the show. So that's example one from Germany. The next example is the Biennale of Photography in 2023 in Germany, which was curated by three, again, non-Western curators, one of whom, Shahidul Alam. Some of you may be familiar with him. He's a Bangladeshi photojournalist and activist, was the Time Person of the Year in 2018. He spoke out on his social media and criticized the Israeli military. And this was seen by the German government as crossing the line into anti-Semitism. They cancelled his involvement with the Biennale. And ultimately, the other curators pulled out, and the Biennale itself was cancelled. And final example, not from Germany, but from the US, of Art Forum, which is an important art publication. The editor-in-chief of that publication in 2023 published an open letter from the art world signed by many important figures calling for Palestinian liberation. He was fired from his post. And so these are just some examples, and there are many, many more, and I would encourage you, if you're interested, to read the reports by Free Muse, who look into creativity and freedom of expression. But there have been many examples of artists having their work cancelled, contracts withdrawn, opportunities lost due to the political sensitivity of their work. And so I think there's a really delicate balance here between freedom of expression, people being able to express themselves, and the role that governments and institutions have to play in both supporting those narratives and censoring them. And so if we see the arts as a field that traditionally had more latitude in terms of this type of expression and people being able to speak their truth and speak truth to power, then I think that there are some dangerous signals coming from some of these examples that we need to consider around the idea of guardrails and government involvement.
Thank you so much. Yeah, there's guardrails, and then when it comes to repercussions, we're all thinking about cancel culture. And so even though there might not be actual guardrails, there is this societal norm that is feeding into some of this cancel culture. But going to an institution of the government, how would you respond?
I think this is a very delicate topic, but it's important to say that words do matter and words can kill. We have the example of, in 2017, with Rohingya community in Myanmar. We have the example of, in the Tigray region, the conflict was also started online, but the repercussion was offline, and definitely was a very bad repercussion. We have the incident now in the UK. So it's important to really make sure that governments have really clear guardrails, but more important, I think it's in freedom of speech. It's definitely a pillar of our democracy, but it's not an absolute right. So we have fortunately in Europe, a lot of frameworks like the European Convention and also now the DCA, the Digital Service Act, that impose some limits in freedom of speech for public safety, for national security. And it's important, we have in the COVID time, we know how many fake news and misinformation definitely were spread. So it's important to make sure, more than have frameworks that we already have, that states really have the resources to enforcement these laws and these strong legal tools that we already have. And what happened, for instance, in Germany with the new regulation, there is a lot of discretionarity, and actually social media, the social media can self-regulate in a way. So there is going now a lot of controversy in this specific law because of this. We have to make sure that the states have the resources and not rely too much on social media to actually battle the misinformation.
Thank you. That's a great segue to the next question that I have, because it is focusing on social media. So should government and workplace leaders be responsible for removing or policing digital or even in-person content? So we touched on this a little bit already, but I'd kind of like to double click on this. And maybe I can start with you, Tanya.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would like to bring up our wonderful far-right government in Finland right now. For example, our Minister Ville Tavio, who used the formerly known as Twitter platform X to describe the opening ceremony of Paris Olympics as a freak show, who then went on to decline to join the Ukraine Equality Alliance due to the Finns party's stance on LGBTQIA, or should I say his personal stance on LGBTQIA. So if people in the echelons of power are behaving this way in social media and decrying any backlash as their freedom to speak, and then carry on being anti-climate justice, etc., what is the example that they are setting, and why are they given this position of power, but at the same time normal people are being called out on their posts that use freedom of speech. Also, another example is when Boris Johnson, the former Prime Minister of Britain, described women wearing niqabs in a very non-positive way. The incidences of racial violence increased after this post of his. So we cannot just close our eyes to the fact that those that are in power set the tone and the example. And we cannot expect Meta, which is a for-profit company, to then start to police things when we cannot run our own house.
That's so true. The impact is, yes. The impact all around is quite stunning. It takes me to what's happening in the US and the accusations about, or the allegations, the false narrative about Springfield, Ohio, and people eating cats and dogs, and how that has crippled the community. The Haitian community, the entire community, with bomb threats in schools, kids have been sent home. So the impact is real from these leaders in power. So is there anything from?
Yeah, I was just thinking about what you were saying, and also just reflecting on it in terms of from a workplace perspective, and also of course agreeing with Faye earlier, because when I was talking about the social contract that we build is from the perspective of what we need to do to protect a specifically marginalized group within workspace and organizations. One fact that I think is very interesting in this context is when you look at institutions that people trust, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, employers are at the top of the list. So over governmental institutions, legal, financial, whatever, the institution that people trust the most is their employer, the workplace. So do with that information as you will, but I think it shows a real power there is if you actually try to use your workplace or use a company organization as a way of not only upholding free speech for those people that need to have their voices amplified, but also putting guardrails in ways that protect them under the guise of free speech or just spreading misinformation. Because another example that I thought of was being from Denmark. I remember last year that a member of parliament of the governing party said that it doesn't matter if people of color speak, or specifically Muslim people of color speak well Danish. It doesn't matter if they're well educated and have good jobs, because they are infiltrating us from the inside in the cafeteria with anti-societal propaganda. Of course, he was citing a Swedish study, and it was debunked that he was citing this study completely wrong, but he said that from the speaker stand in Parliament. So here, unfortunately, I have not read any good examples of this, but in hindsight, a good case example would have been if an employer, a company, went out and actively said, we do not agree with this member of parliament because we value and we trust all of our employees and the skill set and the value that they bring into the workplace. So in that sense, I completely lost my train of thought right there.
You're good.
So when it comes to social media, companies can really establish what do they stand for. People are looking for their workplaces to take a stance, to stand for something, to have values. So don't just have values, live by them, uphold your social contract. If you say these are our values, this is what we stand by, live by them, have people know that when they join the company, when you are rebuilding this while people are in the company, leverage your communication channels and teams to understand that people, so that people understand what does it mean to be part of this organization. Because then it's also easier to ask people to be representative of you when they're navigating, for example, social media. But from a company perspective, there's also protection, right? Because the way that your employees or people act on social media, it can also backlash on you as a company and as a brand. So you also have to have those conversations in terms of what protective measures are we doing for ourselves?
Thank you. Faye?
So taking it back a little bit to the idea of social media platforms and also then the algorithms that are kind of inherent within them, I think both Tanya and Mark-Ivan have brought up really interesting points about the type of perspectives shared, but I think we also have to interrogate the platforms themselves, and we have to also interrogate those algorithms. And I think we need to everybody in society around the world needs to think critically about the cultural, political, and corporate interests that are embedded within AI systems, within social media platforms. The dearth of content that is or the sheer amount of content that gets created and put onto social media platforms, it's impossible for any government, any platform itself to regulate that manually, and so they do rely on algorithms, but these are inherently biased, and there are broader ethical concerns with them. And so I wanted to share a little bit of information from a study that I recommend you all check out, which is published by researchers from Stanford. It's called Annotators with Attitude and was published in 2021. And it looked at AI systems, sort of regulation processes, and found that systems disproportionately flag African American vernacular English, so English commonly used by people, black people within the US, as toxic speech while missing genuine hate speech. So phrases like something is fire or something is bomb were tagged as being inciting violence or arson, and whereas racist speech, such as likening somebody to a monkey, for example, was not tagged as toxic. So there are biases inherently built into these systems, and if we are relying on them to be regulating kind of what is produced and created and allowed to exist in online spaces, then we have to be aware that they represent the biases of the people that created them. So I think that's a huge thing for all of us to think critically about as we engage with online spaces and as we use platforms like ChatGPT and other AI tools. The other part of this, I think, is the hidden workforce, the people who have to manually check that content which is online, often low-paid, people who are in very precarious working conditions with little support for their mental health, for their emotional well-being. And that labor is a harsh reality of how these social media platforms operate at scale as well. So I think there needs to be more kind of thought in terms of how these platforms are regulated and ethical guidelines for both, for all sort of aspects of that. But more importantly, I think we need to be tackling the root causes and the societal issues that exist in terms of why people are generating hateful content in the first place. And I think that the content itself is a symptom of something wider and more systemic within societies that we need to be addressing. And I think Chisholm really eloquently said it this morning. It's about, the real work is in bridging our divides. It's about fostering empathy, understanding, and trying to build a more inclusive society. And yeah, I think it's great that this conference exists for us to talk about that.
Yes, very well done. Well said. And conferences like this gives us a chance to really dive deep and not just give lip service and, you know, thought-provoking things. And so on that, I would like to close out with our last question, which is a heavy one. So how can we balance the right of free speech with the need to prevent the spread of harmful misinformation in modern democracies and workplaces without actually slipping into censorship or limiting open discourse? I know we've touched on this a bit, but it's such a layered topic. So I'm going to start with Mr. Andre.
Well, that's definitely a delicate balance when you talk about freedom of speech and other rights. But I think it's very important to have clear guidelines, and especially making sure that we have a process of appeal that makes sure that citizens who actually can appeal and say if their opinion was wrongly censorship. So it's important that we have clear guidelines to make sure that opinions that can be from minorities and can be censored by social media don't go in that direction. So I think it's probably the most important thing, is to make sure that we have clear guidelines.
Excellent. Clear guidelines. Tanya.
I'm going to say something controversial. I would say connect with people in real life. Because online is not a safe place to be if you're a racialized person, if you're a person that's being shadow banned for supporting not genocide, if you are at all a community leader that goes against the flow. I would say, why are we existing in spaces that are not conducive to our well-being? I know many creators and activists that choose not to be on X, Twitter, and it has done wonders for their mental health. I would recommend that we focus on, of course, social media as a tool to reach other doers, but to not rely on it, because it is not a safe place to be, and it's not also a good place to be. And it's also not great for the environment. Have you heard what ChatGPT does to our environment? Here is a controversial thought.
Thank you. Faye.
I think back to what Tanya mentioned earlier about media literacy, about critical thinking, about sort of considering what we're absorbing, what we're taking in, what we're allowing into our minds, and equipping ourselves better to be more critical of what we're seeing in the media. I think it's very easy to exist in echo chambers and to only see things that reinforce our own worldviews. And so finding ways to step out of that, as both of you have given examples of that, I think is critically important, that we need to be reaching out, we need to be going beyond sort of our own little bubbles and seeking to understand one another, I think is really important.
As Chisholm was saying, the bridge. That's what I'm hearing you also say, that importance of bridging. All right.
Yeah, and to build or to bridge on that, big question. So I'm trying to break it down to kind of like, okay, what can we control? What is kind of like an everyday thing? So on top of connecting with people, I think is also the practice of practicing asking each other for sources, or not in terms of like, what are your sources, but in terms of like, oh, why do you say that? Or where did that come from? Where did you read that? Where does that come? Where is that information placed? How is it produced? Who produced it? Why did they do that? Or why did they phrase it like that? And there are a lot of soft ways of doing that, which is just be like talking with someone and say like, I heard this. It's like, oh, where did you hear that from? Or, by the way, if you have a link, can you send it my way? Just so like that we keep each other accountable, but also for ourselves in our echo chambers to remember, oh, why am I actually following this source? Or I'm reading this thing specifically on social media, specifically in this time where there's a lot of conflict that is coming to the forefront. You read something about this country is doing this to that country, you're like, oh my God, it's bad. I want to support by sharing this news, but then taking that step of being like, wait, let me just maybe Google that, or maybe just like search, like, is this accurate? Can I find this through various sources to increase my likelihood of believing that it is true? So just bringing that practice into yourself and being the change that you want to see, because you are critical of the sources that you consume and reflective of why you're doing it. A last example to finish on that, one of the most cited online dictionaries in Denmark, it was interesting that one activist called out that last year when you look up the word state terrorism, they had an example of like the definition of that word, and the example at that time was, you know, Israel did da-da-da-da-da. That's an example of state terrorism. However, if you look up that definition today, that has been changed to an example that includes Russia instead. So even when we cite things we think should be all being like dictionaries or lexicons, we also have to interrogate that. Who writes the dictionaries? Who write the definitions? Who write the lexicons? So we cannot just cite them as that because it's in there, then that is truth. So just to show like the depth of critical thinking that is needed to navigate this world.
Thank you. So it's no easy solution, you know. It is a complicated, complex situation. I think we've heard about the importance of media literacy, bridging the gap, getting out of our bubbles, the different silos of facts in which we operate in. Yes, benefit of the doubt. What is it? Trust, but verify. You know. So I just wanted to say thank you so much to our wonderful panelists for the work that you've done, the insights you've shared, the work that you're doing. It's been inspiring to meet each and every one of you. And thank you so much for all of you for taking the time to sit here. Hopefully you've come away with some actual tangible tidbits. And let's have an amazing rest of our day. Thank you.